September 1945. The transport ship lurched through the Atlantic swells, its hull groaning against waves that had carried armies, refugees, and now prisoners across an ocean that separated worlds. In the hold below, 47 German women sat on wooden benches, bolted to the floor, their gray auxiliary uniforms stained with weeks of travel, their faces hollow with exhaustion and dread. They were clerks, radio operators, nurses, telephone switchboard workers. Women who had worn the Wehrmacht eagle on their sleeves and now wore tags around their necks like livestock bound for market. The youngest, Erika Schneider, was 19 years old. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of her bench, knuckles white against the wood. She had been a telegraph operator in France, sending coded messages she never understood to destinations she never questioned. When the Americans swept through in the final days, she had hidden in a wine cellar for 3 days, drinking rainwater that pooled in the corners, and eating moldy bread until the silence above convinced her that resistance had ended. Now she was crossing an ocean to a land she had been taught to fear more than death itself. Beside her sat Helene Fischer, 31 years old, a nurse who attended wounded soldiers in field hospitals from Normandy to the Rhine. Her hands, once steady enough to hold a scalpel during bombardments, now shook constantly. She had seen what shells did to bodies, what fire did to flesh, what desperation did to men. But she had never seen America, and everything she knew about it came from propaganda that promised degradation, humiliation, perhaps worse. The ship's engines throbbed like a mechanical heartbeat, steady and indifferent. Above deck, American sailors moved with casual efficiency, their voices carrying through the ventilation shafts. The women listened to those alien sounds, trying to parse meaning from rhythm and tone. Some wept silently. Others stared at nothing, their eyes glazed with the exhaustion of those who have stopped hoping for mercy. During the crossing, they were fed twice daily, beans and bread, coffee that tasted of rust, occasionally a piece of fruit that seemed impossibly fresh. The portions were generous, more than most had eaten in months. Some refused to touch the food, convinced it was drugged or poison. Others ate ravenously, shame and hunger warring on their faces. Erika forced herself to eat slowly, remembering her mother's advice that dignity meant never revealing desperation, but her stomach cramped with need, and each bite felt like both salvation and betrayal. On the fourth night, a storm hit. The ship pitched violently, sending women sprawling across the floor. Buckets overturned, vomit mixed with seawater, and the air grew thick with the stench of fear and sickness. An American medic came below, his young face pale but professional. He helped women back to their benches, handed out towels, spoke in English words that meant nothing, but carried a tone of reassurance. When one woman collapsed, shaking with fever, he called for help, and within minutes, she was carried topside to the infirmary. Helene watched this with narrowed eyes. She had expected cruelty, violence, the casual brutality that propaganda had promised. Instead, she saw procedure. The medic treated the sick woman not as an enemy or a prisoner, but as a patient. It was disorienting, this absence of hatred. It made everything she had been told about Americans feel less solid, more like mist that might burn away under scrutiny. The women whispered among themselves in the darkness, voices low and urgent. Some insisted this was theater, a performance designed to soften them before the real punishment began. Others admitted reluctantly that perhaps the enemy was not what they had imagined. But all of them, every single one, braced for the moment when masks would fall and cruelty would reveal itself. When land finally appeared on the horizon, the women crowded at the portholes, staring at a coastline that rose green and untouched by war. No ruins, no craters, no skeletal buildings clawing at the sky. Instead, there were docks busy with commerce, cranes lifting cargo, warehouses gleaming white in the sunlight. The sheer normalcy of it was shocking. This was the enemy's homeland, and it looked like paradise. The ship docked at New York, and the women were marched down the gangway under guard. They expected crowds, jeers, perhaps violence. Instead, they found indifference. Dock workers barely glanced their way, too busy with their labor to spare attention for German prisoners. A few children waved from behind a fence, their faces curious rather than hostile. It was as if the women were invisible, beneath notice, already forgotten by a nation that had moved on from war. Buses waited, their engines rumbling. The women climbed aboard, still silent, still waiting for the blow that never came. As the convoy pulled away from the port, they pressed their faces to the windows, desperate to understand this strange new world. What they saw defied everything they had been taught. Streets lined with automobiles, not military vehicles, but civilian cars, gleaming in every color. Shop windows filled with goods, clothing and shoes and toys displayed with careless abundance. Neon signs flickering to life as dusk fell, advertising movies and restaurants and promises of plenty. People walked freely, their clothes clean, their faces unhaunted by hunger. Women wore stockings and lipstick. Men carried newspapers under their arms. Children chased each other down sidewalks, their laughter audible even through the bus windows. Erika stared at a bakery window where bread was stacked in golden pyramids, more bread than her entire village had seen in a year. She thought of her younger sister, who had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1943, her body too weak from hunger to fight infection. She thought of her mother, boiling potato, peels for soup, stretching a single turnip across 3 days. And here was a nation at war, displaying bread like it was worthless. The buses traveled for hours, carrying them inland through landscapes unmarred by bombs. Farmhouses stood intact, their windows glowing with electric light. Fields stretched green and productive, no craters interrupting their geometry. Towns appeared and vanished, each one a testament to a war that had happened somewhere else, to someone else. The German women watched in stunned silence, their certainties crumbling with each passing mile. Helene found herself thinking about the propaganda films she had been shown during training. America portrayed as a collapsing giant, its people starving, its cities burning with riots, its government corrupt and weak. She had believed those images because she needed to believe them. If the enemy was suffering, then German suffering had meaning. But what she saw now made those films feel like fever dreams, hallucinations born of desperation rather than truth. Night fell, and the buses continued through darkness, punctuated by lights. Gas stations open and operating, diners glowing warm and inviting. Movie theaters with marquees announcing films in bold letters. Even at night, America looked alive, prosperous, untouched. Some women began to weep, not from relief, but from the terrible understanding of how completely they had been lied to. The buses finally pulled through gates crowned with barbed wire, entering a compound that would become their temporary home. Guard towers stood at intervals, searchlights sweeping across the grounds. Wooden barracks stretched in neat rows, each one identical, each one painted and maintained. The women were ordered off the buses, and they obeyed mechanically, their bodies moving while their minds struggled to process what they had seen. An American officer stood waiting, his uniform crisp, his face impassive. Beside him, a translator, a German-American woman whose accent carried traces of Bavaria. The officer spoke, and the translator rendered his words into German. "You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated according to international law. You will be housed, fed, and given medical care. You will work if you are able, and you will be paid for your labor. You will not be mistreated. You will obey the rules of this camp. Any violation will result in disciplinary action, but no punishment will be cruel or unusual." The words sounded impossible, They had been prepared for threats, for degradation, for commands barked with contempt. Instead, they heard regulations delivered with bureaucratic precision. It was more unsettling than cruelty would have been. The women were divided into groups and led to different barracks. Erika found herself in a long wooden building with rows of bunks, each covered with a thin mattress and a folded blanket. Windows let in the last light of day. A wood stove sat cold in the center of the room. The floor was swept clean. It was Spartan, but not cruel, functional, but not degrading. Then came the announcement that would become the first true shock of their captivity. You will proceed to the sanitation building for delousing and bathing. Leave your belongings on your bunks. Take only the items you need for washing. You will be issued clean clothing afterward. The words landed like stones. Bathing. The women exchanged glances, their faces pale. This was the moment they had been warned about. This was where humiliation would begin. They had heard stories, whispered in the dark during the long retreat, about women forced to strip before leering guards, about cameras recording their shame, about violations disguised as procedure. Erika felt her hands go numb. She had promised herself she would die before she let the enemy see her broken. Now that moment had arrived, and her courage felt thin as paper. Around her, other women began to cry quietly, their shoulders shaking. Helene stood rigid, her jaw clenched so hard her teeth ached. They were marched across the compound to a low building that steamed in the cooling evening air. Guards, all women, stood at the entrance. Their faces were professional, neither kind nor cruel. They gestured for the prisoners to enter, and the women shuffled forward, each step heavier than the last. Inside, the air was warm and humid, thick with the smell of soap and disinfectant. Wooden benches lined the walls. Hooks hung empty, waiting for clothing. At the far end of the room, a doorway led to another space where water hissed and steam rose in clouds. The female guards spoke in English, and the translator repeated their instructions in German. Remove all clothing and place it in the bins provided. You will shower with soap. Take your time. The water is hot. When you are finished, you will find towels and clean garments in the next room. Your old clothing will be laundered or discarded depending on its condition. The women stood frozen, disbelief warring with terror. Take your time. The water is hot. These phrases made no sense. Where was the contempt, the mockery, the violation they had been promised? Slowly, reluctantly, they began to undress. Erika's fingers fumbled with buttons, her whole body shaking. She kept her eyes down, afraid to meet anyone's gaze, afraid to see pity or shame reflected back. When her uniform fell away, she felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with nakedness. She was 19 years old, and she had never felt more vulnerable. But then she noticed something that stopped her breath. The guards had turned away. They were not watching. They stood with their backs to the prisoners, offering privacy that had not been requested, granting dignity that had not been demanded. One by one, the women moved toward the showers. Erika stepped through the doorway and stopped, her breath catching in her throat. Rows of shower heads lined the tiled walls, and from each one, steam rose in thick white clouds. She reached out with a trembling hand and touched the water. It was hot, not lukewarm, not tepid, but genuinely hot, almost scalding. She jerked her hand back, then touched it again, unable to believe. Around her, other women were making the same discovery. They stood under the streams, water sluicing over skin that had not felt true warmth in months, perhaps years. The sound that rose from the room was strange and terrible, a chorus of sobs and gasps, and something that might have been laughter or might have been breaking. Helene stood under a shower head, her hands covering her face, water running through her fingers. She had not bathed in hot water since before the war. In the field hospitals, they had washed with cold water from buckets, scrubbing blood and dirt with harsh soap that left their skin raw. Later, during the retreat, there had been no washing at all, only the attempt to stay alive one more day. Now hot water poured over her, and she could not stop crying. It was not relief. It was not gratitude. It was the terrible realization that the enemy was capable of this, of treating them with a gentleness their own nation had long abandoned. The Reich had demanded sacrifice, had asked them to endure cold and hunger and fear for the promise of glory. And here was America offering hot water to its prisoners. Bars of soap sat in niches along the walls, white and clean and smelling of lavender. Erika picked one up, holding it like a relic. Real soap, not the gray ersatz blocks that dissolved into useless foam, but actual soap that lathered and cleaned. She scrubbed herself until her skin burned, washing away months of grime, and with it, something else. Some certainty she had carried, some belief about the world and her place in it. The women stayed in the showers longer than necessary, letting the water run over them until their fingers pruned and their skin turned pink. When they finally emerged wrapped in towels that were rough but clean, they found stacks of clothing waiting. Not their old uniforms, but simple dresses made of sturdy cotton, gray and shapeless but whole. Undergarments, clean and new. Socks without holes. Everything marked with the letters PW, but everything intact. Erika dressed slowly, her body feeling strange and light without the weight of dirt and despair. She caught sight of herself in a small mirror on the wall and barely recognized the face that looked back. Clean. That was the only word that mattered. She looked clean. When they returned to the barracks, the women moved like sleepwalkers, their minds struggling to reconcile what had happened with what they had been taught to expect. Some sat on their bunks in silence, staring at nothing. Others whispered to each other, voices fragile with confusion. That night, as darkness settled over the camp, Erika lay awake, her hair still damp against the pillow. Her body was clean, truly clean, for the first time in longer than she could remember. But her mind churned with questions that had no easy answers. If the enemy could show them this kindness, what did that mean about everything else they had been told? If Americans could give them hot water and soap, could they also be human? And if they were human, what did that make the women who had served the Reich, who had believed the lies, who had sent messages and tended wounds and kept the machine running? The smell of soap clung to her skin, a scent that should have been comforting, but felt instead like an accusation. She thought of her mother, who had not bathed in hot water in years, who washed with snow melted in a pot, who scrubbed her children's clothes with lye that burned her hands. And here was her daughter, a prisoner of war, bathing in luxury. In the bunk beside her, Helene lay equally awake, her mind tracing similar paths. She had been a nurse, had sworn an oath to heal, to preserve life, but she had done so in service of a regime that had destroyed millions. She had believed, or told herself she believed, that she was serving a greater good. Now hot water had washed away more than dirt. It had washed away the comfortable certainty of hatred. The next morning brought more shocks. Breakfast was served in a mess hall, where the women sat at long tables, and trays were brought to them by American soldiers who moved with efficient indifference. The food was simple but abundant. Oatmeal with milk and sugar, bread, actual white bread, with butter, coffee that tasted real, fruit, oranges cut into sections that gleamed like small suns. Erika stared at her tray, unable to move. This was more food than her family had seen in a week. Her father had been killed at Stalingrad. Her mother and two surviving siblings lived in a basement in Hamburg, eating boiled cabbage and black bread when they could get it. And here she sat, a prisoner, eating oranges. She forced herself to take a bite, then another. The sweetness of the orange was almost painful, flooding her mouth with a taste she had nearly forgotten. Around her, other women ate with the same mechanical determination, their faces blank, their eyes wet. After breakfast, they were assembled in the yard for a briefing. An American officer, tall and gray at the temples, stood before them with the translator at his side. He explained the rules of the camp in a voice that was firm but not cruel. Work assignments would be given based on skills. Payment would be made in camp script that could be used to purchase items from the canteen. Letters could be sent and received, though they would be censored. Medical care would be provided. Punishment for rule violations would be swift but fair. It all sounded so reasonable, so bureaucratic. There was no gloating, no mockery, no reminder that they were the defeated enemy. Just procedure, endless procedure, as if they were employees rather than prisoners. Then came the moment that would define everything that followed. The officer paused, then spoke words. The translator rendered with careful precision. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will not be abused. You will not be starved. You will not be degraded. You are prisoners of war, not criminals. You will be held until such time as arrangements can be made for your repatriation. Until then, you will live under American authority. We expect your cooperation. We will provide for your basic needs. Erika listened to these words and felt something crack inside her chest. Not relief, not gratitude. Something harder and more painful. The understanding that she had been lied to. About everything. The days that followed established a rhythm that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. Each morning the women woke to a bell, washed in sinks with running water, and ate breakfast in the mess hall. They were assigned work details, some in the camp kitchen, others in the laundry, still others in the gardens that surrounded the compound. The work was not difficult, and they were given breaks, water, even lunch brought out to them. Erika was assigned to the library, a small building that housed books in multiple languages. Her job was to organize the shelves, repair damaged volumes, and help prisoners check out materials. It was work she had never imagined doing as a captive. She spent her days surrounded by books, by ideas, by worlds that existed beyond barbed wire. The library held novels, histories, even poetry. Some were in German, smuggled in or donated by German Americans. Others were in English, their pages filled with words she was slowly learning to decode. She found herself drawn to American authors, curious about the minds that had created this strange nation. She read Steinbeck and Hemingway, their prose spare and direct, so different from the dense, philosophical texts she had studied in school. One afternoon she discovered a book of photographs, images of America before the war. Cities gleaming with skyscrapers, farms stretching to horizons, families gathered around Thanksgiving tables laden with food. The abundance in those images was not propaganda, it was documentation. This was how Americans had lived before the war, and from what she could see through the camp fence, it was how they still lived. Helene, meanwhile, was assigned to the camp infirmary, assisting an American doctor who spoke broken German. At first, she worked in silence, keeping her head down, afraid to draw attention. But the doctor was patient, explaining procedures, asking her opinion, treating her like a colleague rather than a prisoner. One day, a guard came in with a badly sprained ankle. The doctor was busy with another patient, so he gestured for Helene to examine the guard. She hesitated, then moved forward, her training overcoming her fear. She palpated the ankle gently, asked questions through gestures, wrapped it with practiced efficiency. When she finished, the guard thanked her, his voice genuinely grateful. Helene stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. She had treated the enemy, and the enemy had thanked her. It violated everything she understood about war, about captivity, about the natural order of things. That night she lay awake, thinking about the oath she had sworn as a nurse. First, do no harm. She had believed she was honoring that oath by serving in Wehrmacht hospitals. But now she understood that healing had no nationality, that the Hippocratic ideal transcended flags and borders. The American doctor had shown her that by asking for her help, by trusting her skill, by seeing her as a healer rather than a German. As weeks turned into months, the camp settled into a routine that began to feel almost normal. The women's bodies recovered from the malnutrition and stress of war. Their faces filled out. Their hair regained its shine. Color returned to their cheeks. They began to look less like refugees and more like the young women they had been before the war consumed them. But this physical recovery came with its own burden. Every ounce of weight they gained, every improvement in their health, was a reminder of the contrast between their lives as prisoners and the lives of their families back home. Letters arrived sporadically, carried across the ocean by the Red Cross. The news was always the same: hunger, cold, desperation. Erika received a letter from her mother that she read once and then hid under her mattress, unable to bear reading it again. "We are down to 1 meal a day. Your brother has stopped growing. I fear he will not survive another winter. Please, if you have anything, send it. We are so hungry." She folded the letter with trembling hands, knowing there was nothing she could send, knowing that she ate 3 meals a day while her brother starved. The guilt was crushing, more painful than any physical punishment could have been. The camp canteen added another layer of surreal contrast. With the script they earned from their work, the women could purchase items that had vanished from Germany years ago. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, toothpaste, hair ribbons, even lipstick. The shelves were stocked with casual abundance, as if these were ordinary times, as if war had never touched this place. The first time Erika bought a chocolate bar, she held it in her hands for a long time before unwrapping it. Hershey's, the label said, with letters she was learning to read. She broke off a square and placed it on her tongue, and the sweetness made her cry. Not from joy, but from the terrible knowledge that this small luxury represented a gulf between her and her family that could never be bridged. Some women refused to buy anything, hoarding their script as if it might somehow be converted into food they could send home. Others purchased items compulsively, as if by consuming American goods, they could fill the void inside them. Still others bought things and then gave them away, unable to enjoy what they knew their families lacked. The Americans seemed genuinely puzzled by the women's distress. To them, the camp was operating exactly as it should. Prisoners were fed, housed, and treated humanely. What more could be asked? They did not understand, could not understand, the psychological weight of being treated well while your nation starved. One day, a Red Cross inspector visited the camp. He was Swiss, neutral, tasked with ensuring that the Geneva Convention was being upheld. He interviewed several women, asking about conditions, treatment, food, work. Erika found herself sitting across from him, struggling to explain what she felt. "Are you treated fairly?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Are you given adequate food?" "Yes." "Are you abused or mistreated?" "No," he wrote in his notebook, satisfied. But Erika wanted to scream. How could she explain that the fairness itself was a form of torment? That every kindness was a reminder of how completely their world had been inverted? That being treated humanely by the enemy was harder to bear than cruelty would have been? As autumn arrived, the Americans introduced something new: classes. The women were invited, not ordered, to attend lessons in English, American history, civics, even typing and shorthand. The announcement was met with suspicion and confusion. Why would the enemy want to educate them? Erika attended the first English class out of curiosity, expecting propaganda. Instead, she found a patient teacher, a young woman from Boston who spoke slowly and wrote clearly on the blackboard. The lesson focused on simple phrases: hello, goodbye, please, thank you. Words that had no political content, that were simply tools for communication. She found herself returning, day after day, drawn by something she could not name. Learning English felt like opening a window in a locked room. Each new word was a small act of rebellion against the isolation of her own mind. She began to understand fragments of conversation, to parse meaning from the guards' casual banter, to glimpse the humanity beneath the uniforms. The civics classes were more controversial. They explained American government, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the concept of democracy. Some women walked out, refusing to listen to what they saw as propaganda. Others stayed, their faces skeptical but curious. The teacher did not demand they believe, only that they listen. One day the teacher read aloud from the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Erika listened to these words, hearing them first in English, then in German as the teacher translated. She thought about the Reich's philosophy, about hierarchy and racial purity and the glorification of strength. And here was America, claiming that rights were inherent, not granted by the state. It was a fundamental inversion of everything she had been taught. That night, lying in her bunk, she whispered those words to herself. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. They sounded naive, almost childish, but they also sounded like something she had forgotten existed. Hope. The classes on American history were even more disorienting. The teacher spoke of a nation built by immigrants, by people fleeing oppression, by those seeking a second chance. She talked about the American Revolution, about colonists who had rebelled against tyranny, about a constitution designed to limit government power rather than expand it. She showed maps of a continent that stretched from ocean to ocean, vast enough to contain multitudes. Helene attended these classes reluctantly at first, arms crossed, face set in skeptical lines. But slowly, despite herself, she became engaged. She asked questions, her voice sharp and challenging. If America believed in equality, what about the segregation she had heard about? If they valued liberty, why did they have so many people in prison? If they pursued happiness, why did their cities have slums? The teacher did not deflect or deny. Yes, she said, America has contradictions. We do not always live up to our ideals. But the ideals exist, and they give us something to strive toward. That is the difference between aspiration and oppression. Helene wanted to argue, but found she had no response. The Reich had never aspired to anything beyond domination. There had been no gap between ideal and practice because the ideal itself was conquest. The American cinema nights became another source of confusion and wonder. Once a week, a projector was set up in the mess hall and films were shown. The women expected war propaganda, tales of American heroism and German villainy. Instead, they saw comedies, musicals, dramas that had nothing to do with war. They watched Charlie Chaplin stumble through absurdist situations, and despite themselves, they laughed. They saw Judy Garland sing about rainbows, and some women hummed the melody for days afterward. They witnessed the glamour of Hollywood musicals, women in sequin dresses dancing across vast stages, and marveled at the casual display of wealth. But the most powerful films were the newsreels, shown before each feature. These did contain war footage, but not what the women expected. They saw images of liberated concentration camps, the skeletal survivors, the mass graves, the evidence of systematic extermination. They saw interviews with survivors, heard their testimonies, witnessed the documentation that would eventually be presented at Nuremberg. The mess hall grew silent during these reels. Some women wept, others turned away. Still others watched with the grim fascination of those confronting a truth they had suspected but never confirmed. The scale of it, the industrialization of death, the bureaucratic precision of genocide, it was beyond anything they had imagined. After one such screening, Helene found herself outside, vomiting into the grass. She had known somewhere deep down that something terrible was happening, but knowing and seeing were different things. The images burned themselves into her mind, and she understood with sickening clarity that she had been part of the machine that made it possible. She had healed soldiers so they could return to the front. She had kept the system functioning. She had asked no questions. Erika, too, was shattered by the newsreels. She had been a telegraph operator, tapping out codes she never translated. How many of those messages had coordinated transports to the camps? How many had facilitated the logistics of murder? Her hands felt dirty, and no amount of hot water could wash them clean. The Americans did not force discussions of these films. They simply presented the evidence and let it work on the women's consciences. It was a different kind of warfare, one that attacked certainty rather than bodies, one that dismantled belief rather than buildings. As winter approached, the camp made preparations. More blankets were distributed. The wood stoves in the barracks were lit. Warm coats appeared. Surplus military jackets dyed gray and stamped with PW. The women bundled themselves against the cold, grateful for the warmth even as they thought of families shivering in ruins. Christmas arrived with shocking ceremony. The Americans decorated the mess hall with garlands and a tree strung with lights. Packages arrived from church groups and civic organizations, boxes filled with small gifts. Soap, handkerchiefs, candy, socks. Each woman received a package, her name written on a card in careful English script. Erika opened hers to find a bar of scented soap, a pair of wool socks, 3 candy canes, and a handwritten note. From the Ladies' Auxiliary of St. Paul's Methodist Church, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. May you find peace this Christmas season. She stared at the note, trying to understand it. These women, these American women, had taken time to assemble packages for German prisoners. Women whose sons and husbands might have died fighting Germans. Women who had every reason to hate. Yet here was this gift, freely given, expecting nothing in return. The Christmas meal was a feast by any standard. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, fresh rolls, and pie for dessert. The women ate in stunned silence, forks moving mechanically from plate to mouth. Some could not finish, their stomachs rebelling against such richness. Others ate everything, including the food left by their neighbors, driven by a hunger that had less to do with their bodies than their souls. After the meal, American guards and some of the camp staff sang carols. Their voices, male and female, blended in harmonies that carried through the cold night air. Silent night, O come all ye faithful. Joy to the world. The women listened, some joining in with German verses, their voices tentative at first, then stronger. For a moment, in that mess hall decorated with borrowed joy, the war felt very far away. Erika looked around at the faces of her fellow prisoners, at the American guards who had set aside their weapons to sing, and felt something shift inside her. It was not forgiveness, it was not friendship, but it was recognition. We are all human, she thought. Beneath the uniforms and the nationalities and the hatreds, we are all just human. The moment passed. Guards returned to their posts. Prisoners returned to their barracks. The war resumed its place as a central fact of their existence. But the memory of that Christmas lingered, a small light in a dark time. Letters from home grew more desperate as the winter deepened. Erika's mother wrote that her brother had died, his body too weak from malnutrition to fight off influenza. The letter was dated 6 weeks earlier, which meant he had been dead for a month before she learned of it. She sat on her bunk, the letter in her hands, and did not cry. She was too empty for tears. Helene received word that her husband, a Luftwaffe pilot, was confirmed dead, shot down over France in the final days of the war. She had suspected it for months, but confirmation made it real. She was a widow at 31, childless, with no home to return to. Her parents' house in Dresden had been destroyed in the firebombing. She was alone in the world, and the only people who fed her were the enemy. The weight of these losses pressed down on the women, making the comfort of the camp feel like an obscenity. They were warm, fed, safe, while their families died in the ruins. Some began to refuse food, picking at their meals, giving away their portions. Others grew angry, picking fights, testing the limits of American patience. The camp administrators responded not with punishment, but with additional medical attention. A psychiatrist was brought in, a woman who spoke fluent German and spent hours in one-on-one conversations. She did not offer platitudes or easy comfort. She simply listened, creating space for the women to speak their guilt and grief aloud. Erika found herself in the psychiatrist's office, sitting in a chair that was surprisingly comfortable. The woman, Dr. Margaret Klein, a German Jewish refugee who had fled to America in 1938, waited patiently for Erika to speak. "I don't know how to feel," Erika finally said. "My brother is dead, and I am alive. I eat while my mother starves. I sleep in a warm bed while my country freezes. What right do I have to this?" Dr. Klein nodded slowly. "Survivor's guilt," she said. "It is very common. You feel you should suffer because others are suffering, but your suffering does not reduce theirs. It only adds to the total amount of suffering in the world." "But I worked for them," Erika whispered. "I sent their messages. I was part of the machine." "Yes," Dr. Klein said. "And now you must decide what to do with that knowledge. You can let it destroy you, or you can let it transform you. The choice is yours. How do I live with what I've done? The same way anyone lives with their past, by acknowledging it, learning from it, and choosing differently in the future. You cannot undo what was done. None of us can, but you can refuse to let it define who you become." Erika left that session feeling not better, exactly, but clearer. The guilt remained, but it no longer paralyzed her. She began to understand that healing was not the same as forgetting, that moving forward did not require abandoning the dead. Spring arrived with sudden violence, transforming the camp almost overnight. Grass pushed through the last snow. Trees budded and bloomed. The air smelled of earth and growing things. The women emerged from their barracks like people waking from hibernation, blinking in the sunshine, slowly remembering what warmth felt like. Work details expanded to include gardening. The women planted vegetables, flowers, herbs. They knelt in the dirt, hands buried in soil, coaxing life from the ground. It was therapeutic in a way no one had anticipated. To plant something, to tend it, to watch it grow, these simple acts restored something that the war had taken. Erika found herself assigned to the flower garden near the camp entrance. She planted peonies, roses, daisies, following instructions from a manual written in English that she was slowly learning to read. The act of planting felt like an investment in a future she could not imagine. These flowers would bloom long after she was gone, a small legacy of beauty in a place built for containment. One afternoon as she was weeding, an American guard stopped to watch. He was young, maybe 22, with red hair and freckles that made him look even younger. He said something in English, his tone friendly. She caught the word pretty and understood he was complimenting the flowers. "Danke," she said, then hesitantly added in broken English, "Thank you." His face lit up. "You're learning English," he said, speaking slowly. "Yes," she replied. "Little, small." He grinned. "Well, you're doing great. Keep it up." It was a brief exchange, meaningless in many ways, but it stayed with her. He had spoken to her like a person, not a prisoner. He had encouraged her. In that moment, the fence between them had seemed less solid, less permanent. These small encounters began to accumulate. A guard sharing cigarettes with prisoners during a work break. A cook sneaking extra portions to women who looked particularly thin. A chaplain offering to mail letters that bypassed the censor. acts of kindness that were technically violations of protocol, but that happened anyway. Not all guards were kind. Some were cold, viewing the prisoners as enemy aliens who deserved no more than the minimum required by regulation. A few were actively hostile, their grief over dead brothers or friends curdling into resentment. But the majority were simply young men doing a job. And in doing that job, they sometimes remembered to be human. The news from Europe grew more concrete as spring progressed. The full extent of the concentration camps was revealed. The Nuremberg trials began, with daily reports detailing the evidence of systematic genocide. Newspapers were posted on bulletin boards, and the women gathered to read them, their faces pale, their hands shaking. Some refused to believe it. "This is propaganda," they insisted, "exaggeration. The Americans want to make us feel ashamed." But the evidence was overwhelming. Photographs from Auschwitz, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, testimony from survivors, documents signed by German officials. The industrial infrastructure of death laid bare in meticulous detail. Even the most skeptical found it hard to dismiss. Helene read the reports with a growing sense of horror. She recognized some of the names, officers she had served under, doctors she had worked beside. People she had thought were dedicated to healing had been conducting experiments on human beings. The oath she had sworn, "First do no harm," had been violated in the most profound way possible. She found herself back in Dr. Klein's office, her voice raw. "How do I reconcile this? I was a nurse. I healed people. But I did it for a regime that murdered millions." Dr. Klein leaned forward, her eyes compassionate but unflinching. "You heal people now," she said. "Every day in the infirmary, you heal. The question is not whether you can erase the past. You cannot. The question is whether you will let the past paralyze you or motivate you. Will you spend the rest of your life frozen by guilt, or will you spend it trying to heal the wounds your nation inflicted? I don't know if I'm strong enough. No one knows if they're strong enough until they try." As summer arrived, rumors began to circulate about repatriation. The war had been over for more than a year. Camps were being emptied. Prisoners were being sent home. The women received the news with mixed emotions. Home meant freedom, but it also meant returning to a country that no longer existed, to families that might not have survived, to a future that was utterly uncertain. Erika tried to imagine going back to Hamburg. What would she find? Her mother, if she had survived, living in a basement, her home destroyed, her city a wasteland. And she would return to this having been fed and clothed and educated by the enemy. How would her neighbors look at her? What would they say? Some women began to speak of staying in America, of finding a way to immigrate rather than repatriate. They had seen enough of American abundance, American order, American possibility to believe that a future here might be better than a return to ruins. But immigration was nearly impossible. They were enemy aliens, prisoners of war. No matter how well they had been treated, they were still Germans, still part of the nation that had started the war. In July, the first group of women was called for repatriation. Their names were read from a list, and they had 48 hours to prepare. Erika was not on the list, but Helene was. They sat together the night before Helene's departure, neither knowing what to say. "I'm afraid," Helene finally admitted. "Not of going home. I'm afraid of what I've become here. I'm afraid that I've forgotten how to survive without 3 meals a day and hot water and a roof that doesn't leak. I'm afraid I've gone soft." "You haven't gone soft," Erika said. "You've healed. There's a difference, have I? Or have I just been comfortable while others suffered? Both can be true." Helene smiled sadly. "You've become wise in this place. What will you do when you're sent back?" "I don't know," Erika admitted. "I don't know if my mother's alive. I don't know if there's anything left to go back to. But I suppose I'll find out." They embraced, two women who had shared a barracks and a profound dislocation of everything they thought they knew. The next morning, Helene boarded a bus with 30 other women, and Erika watched her go, wondering if they would ever see each other again. The weeks that followed felt suspended, dreamlike. Erika continued her work in the library, her classes in English, her tending of the flower garden. But everything felt temporary now, borrowed time before the inevitable return. She found herself memorizing details, trying to hold on to moments she knew she would need later. The way sunlight filtered through the library windows, the smell of books, musty and comforting, the taste of coffee, real coffee, strong and bitter. The feel of hot water on her skin, the sound of American voices, their vowels broad and confident. The sight of abundance, casual and unremarkable. She wrote letters to her mother, not knowing if they would arrive, describing life in the camp in careful terms. She could not tell the truth, that she ate better as a prisoner than her mother did as a civilian. She could not describe the hot baths or the Christmas gifts or the English lessons. It would sound like fantasy, or worse, like betrayal. Instead, she wrote about small things: the weather, the books she was reading, the flowers she had planted, neutral things that could not wound. Her mother's responses when they came were equally careful. Brief mentions of hunger and cold, but always followed by assurances that they were managing, that Erika should not worry. The lies they told each other were acts of love, attempts to spare pain, but they also widened the gulf between them. Erika was living in one reality, her mother in another, and no amount of careful letters could bridge that gap. In August, Erika's name appeared on a repatriation list. She had 2 weeks to prepare for departure. The news hit her like a physical blow, even though she had been expecting it. 2 weeks, 14 days. Then back to Germany, back to ruins, back to a life she could no longer imagine. She spent those 2 weeks in a strange state, present but not present, going through motions while her mind raced ahead to an unknowable future. She gave away most of her possessions, the few items she had accumulated, books to women who would remain longer, sewing supplies to those who needed them. She kept only a bar of soap, wrapped carefully and hidden in her belongings, a small talisman, proof that this had all been real. The night before departure, she walked the perimeter of the camp one last time. The fences no longer looked like barriers, but like the edges of a world she had inhabited, however briefly. The guard towers were lit against the darkening sky, sentinels watching over a temporary city of displaced people. She stopped at the flower garden, now in full bloom. The peonies she had planted were enormous, their petals soft and pink in the fading light. The roses climbed the trellis she had built, red and yellow and white. The daisies spread in cheerful profusion. She had created this, coaxed it from soil and seed, and now she would leave it behind. A guard approached, the same red-haired young man who had complimented her work months ago. "You did good here," he said, gesturing at the flowers. "They'll last a long time after you're gone." "Thank you," she said in careful English. "It was important to make something." He nodded, understanding more than the words conveyed. "Good luck over there," he said. "I hope you find what you're looking for." She wanted to tell him that she wasn't looking for anything, that she was being sent back because that was what prisoners did when wars ended. But she only nodded and said, "Good luck to you also." That night she lay awake in the barracks, listening to the breathing of the women around her. Some slept peacefully, others tossed and turned, restless with their own anxieties. She thought about everything that had happened in this place, all the ways it had unmade and remade her. She had arrived expecting cruelty and found civility. She had braced for degradation and received hot water. She had anticipated hatred and encountered indifference shading into occasional kindness. Nothing had been what she expected, and that dislocation had been more powerful than any punishment. The hot baths had not been mercy. They had been something more complex, a demonstration that the enemy could afford to treat prisoners with dignity, that they had systems and resources so vast that giving prisoners hot water didn't even register as sacrifice. It was the abundance that had broken her, not the kindness, the casual, unstudied abundance of a nation that could fight a global war and still maintain prosperity at home. Morning came with the same bell that had marked every day of her captivity. Breakfast was served, but she could not eat. Her stomach was tight with anxiety and something else. Grief, perhaps, for this liminal space that had sheltered her. She knew that what awaited in Germany would be harder than anything she had experienced here. The buses arrived mid-morning. Women gathered with their small bundles of belongings, faces pale, eyes frightened. Some wept openly. Others stood rigid, refusing to show emotion. Erika found herself somewhere in between, dry-eyed but trembling. An American officer gave a brief speech, translated into German. "You are being repatriated under the terms of international law. You will be transported to ships, then across the Atlantic to Germany. From there, you will be released to German authorities. We wish you well. May you find peace." The words sounded hollow, bureaucratic, but Erika understood what he was really saying. Our responsibility ends here. What happens next is beyond our control. They boarded the buses in alphabetical order. Erika found a seat near the window and pressed her face to the glass as the bus pulled away from the camp. She watched the barracks recede, the flower garden becoming a blur of color, the fences shrinking until they were just lines in the distance. The journey to the port took 2 days by train. They traveled through American landscapes that still looked untouched, prosperous, alive. Cities glowed at night. Fields stretched green and productive. Towns bustled with commerce. It was a final reminder of what they were leaving behind. At the port, they were processed one more time. Names checked, documents stamped, medical examinations to ensure no one was carrying infectious disease. Then they were led up the gangway of a converted troop transport into holds that were cleaner and better maintained than the ship that had brought them to America. The crossing took 12 days. The weather was good, the seas calm. They were fed adequately, given access to deck for fresh air. It was nothing like the first crossing, where fear had been thick enough to taste. Now there was only resignation, the acceptance of fate. Erika spent hours on deck, staring at the ocean, thinking about everything that had changed. She thought about the girl who had crossed this ocean in the opposite direction, terrified and certain of her beliefs. That girl was gone, replaced by someone more complicated, someone who carried doubts and questions like stones in her pocket. When land finally appeared on the horizon, it looked gray and broken, even from a distance. Europe, home. The word felt strange in her mouth, like a lie or a prayer. She wasn't sure which. The ship docked at Bremerhaven, a port city that had been flattened and was slowly being rebuilt. The women disembarked into chaos. Crowds of displaced people, refugees, survivors. The air smelled of ash and desperation. American officials processed them efficiently, stamping their papers, pointing them toward trains that would carry them deeper into Germany. Erika found herself on a platform, clutching her small bundle, surrounded by strangers who looked as lost as she felt. A train arrived, its cars packed with people. She pushed her way aboard, found a corner to stand in, and began the final leg of her journey home. The German landscape unfolded outside the windows like a wound. Cities reduced to rubble, villages with only chimneys standing, fields churned by artillery, bridges collapsed into rivers. Everywhere she looked, she saw destruction, evidence of a war that had come home to roost. Hamburg, when she finally reached it, was unrecognizable. Whole districts had been erased. Streets she had walked as a child no longer existed. She asked directions from a skeletal old woman and was pointed toward the ruins of her neighborhood. She walked through streets that were more memories than places, past buildings that were now just walls, around craters that had once been homes. Children picked through rubble, looking for anything salvageable. Old people sat on stones, staring at nothing. She found the address where her family's apartment had stood and saw only a crater filled with broken brick and twisted metal. Her heart sank. But then a voice called her name. Erika? She turned and saw a woman so thin she was barely recognizable. It took a moment before she realized it was her mother, aged 20 years and 18 months, her face gaunt, her eyes sunken, her clothes hanging on a frame that had lost half its weight. Mama, Erika whispered. They embraced, and Erika felt the bones of her mother's back through her dress. She smelled of smoke and hunger and despair. When they pulled apart, her mother looked at Erika with confusion and something that might have been resentment. You look well, her mother said, the words carrying an edge. Erika understood immediately. She had gained weight in captivity. Her cheeks were full. Her skin was clear. She looked healthy in a way that was obscene in this place of starvation. I was fed, she said simply, unable to lie. Her mother nodded, her face closing down. I'm glad, she said, but the words sounded like they cost her something. They walked together to the basement where her mother now lived, a dark space with water stains on the walls and a single candle for light. Two other families shared the space, divided by hanging blankets. The air was damp and cold despite the summer heat outside. Erika pulled the bar of soap from her bundle and handed it to her mother. It's from America, she said. It's real soap. Her mother took it, holding it like it might burn her. Then she brought it to her nose and inhaled, and tears started down her face. Soap, she whispered. Real soap. That night, Erika lay on a pile of rags that served as a bed, listening to the sounds of the basement, coughing, crying, the whisper of prayers. She thought about the barracks in America, with their wood stoves and clean mattresses and windows that let in light. She thought about hot water cascading from shower heads, about bread in baskets, about books on shelves. She had believed she would feel relief to be home, to be free. Instead, she felt trapped in a different kind of prison, one built of rubble and hunger and impossible memories. She had seen another world, a world of abundance and order, and now she had to live in this one. The contrast was unbearable. In the days that followed, she learned the rhythms of survival in post-war Hamburg, standing in line for rations that never seemed adequate, trading cigarettes for bread, soap for vegetables, picking through rubble for wood to burn, for metal to sell, for anything that might be converted into sustenance. She found work eventually, using her English to translate for American occupation forces. The job paid in rations and occupation marks, enough to feed herself and contribute to her mother's survival. She moved between two worlds, the American offices where coffee was abundant and typewriters worked, and the German streets where children begged and the elderly died quietly in corners. Her English improved rapidly, and with it came opportunities. She was offered a position as a civilian employee of the American military government, with better pay and access to the PX where American goods could be purchased at subsidized prices. She accepted, knowing it would mark her as a collaborator in some eyes, not caring because survival mattered more than pride. Her mother used the soap sparingly, shaving off tiny pieces, making it last for months. She never asked Erika about her time in America, and Erika never volunteered the information. The gulf between their experiences was too wide to bridge with words. But late at night, when her mother thought Erika was asleep, she would take out the soap and smell it, her face softening with something like wonder. Erika would watch through slitted eyes, understanding that the soap represented more than cleanliness. It was proof that somewhere, somehow, life could be different, that abundance was possible, that the world contained more than ruins. Years passed. Hamburg slowly rebuilt. The rubble was cleared. Buildings rose. Life began to flow again through streets that had been dead. Erika continued working for the Americans, her English becoming fluent, her skills valued. She saved money, eventually renting a small apartment with running water and electricity, luxuries that still felt miraculous. Her mother came to live with her, and for the first time since before the war, they had hot water for bathing. Erika showed her how the taps worked, how to adjust the temperature. Her mother stood in the bathtub, water running over her, and wept as she had wept on the day Erika gave her soap. "This is what you had," she said. "In America, this is what prisoners had." "Yes," Erika said simply. Her mother looked at her with understanding that was both painful and freeing. "They treated you better than your own country could." Yes. That night they talked for the first time about Erika's captivity, about the camp, the food, the classes, the hot water. Her mother listened without judgment, asking questions, trying to understand. When Erika finished, her mother said something that would stay with her forever. "You were lucky, not because you were captured, but because you were captured by them. If it had been the Russians, you would not have survived. If it had been us capturing American women." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. But they both knew the truth. The Germans had not treated their prisoners with hot water and English lessons. They had not upheld the Geneva Convention. They had not seen their enemies as human. And that difference, that fundamental difference in how nations chose to exercise power over the vulnerable, had made all the difference. Erika lived a long life. She married eventually an American engineer working on reconstruction projects and emigrated to the United States in 1953. She became a citizen, raised children, built a life in a country that had once been her enemy. She never forgot Hamburg, never forgot the ruins, never forgot the basement where her mother had cried over a bar of soap. But she also never forgot the camp, the moment when she stood under hot water and felt her certainties wash away. That moment had changed her more than any battle, any bombing, any propaganda film. It had shown her that the world was more complex than she had been taught, that enemies could show mercy, that power could be exercised with restraint. In her final years, she was interviewed by historians documenting the experiences of German POWs in America. She spoke at length about the camp, about the treatment she received, about the psychological impact of being treated humanely by those she had been taught to hate. The interviewer asked her what she remembered most clearly from her captivity. "The hot water," she said without hesitation. "The first time I stood under hot water, I understood that everything I had been told was a lie. Not just about Americans, but about everything. About war, about enemies, about the necessity of cruelty. If they could give us hot water when they had every reason to hate us, then everything was possible. Everything could be different." The interviewer pressed her. "Did you feel grateful?" She thought for a long time before answering. "No," she finally said. "Not then. I felt confused, betrayed by my own beliefs, angry that mercy could be so destabilizing. Gratitude came later, much later, when I understood what a gift I had been given. Not the hot water itself, but the demonstration that another way of living was possible." She died in 2006 in a suburban house in Pennsylvania, surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew her as Oma, a sweet old woman with a German accent and a love of gardening. They knew she had been a prisoner during the war, but they didn't really understand what that meant. At her funeral, her oldest son found a small box among her possessions. Inside was a bar of soap, so old it had cracked and yellowed, wrapped in tissue paper that had been carefully preserved for 6 decades. There was no note, no explanation. Just soap, a relic of a moment when everything changed. He brought it to the service and placed it beside her casket, not understanding its significance but respecting her choice to keep it. Among the mourners was another elderly German woman, one of the few survivors from Erika's camp. She saw the soap and smiled, tears running down her face. After the service, she told the son what it meant. "Your mother never forgot," she said. "None of us did. The hot water, the soap, they sound like small things. But they weren't. They were proof that even in war, even in hatred, even in the darkest times, humanity could survive. That was the real victory, not of arms, but of spirit. They defeated us not by destroying us, but by refusing to become what we had been." The son didn't fully understand, but he kept the soap, placed it in his own home as a reminder of something he couldn't name. And perhaps that was fitting. The legacy of those hot baths, those bars of soap, those moments of unexpected mercy. They were not things that could be easily explained. They were experiences that shaped lives, that rippled forward through generations, that demonstrated a truth too large for words. That power, true power, is demonstrated not in how you treat those who can fight back, but in how you treat those who cannot. That victory is measured not in territory conquered, but in humanity preserved. That the strongest nations are not those who crush their enemies, but those who remember that enemies are human too. Erika Schneider's story was not unique. Thousands of German women passed through American POW camps during and after World War II. Most were treated according to the Geneva Convention, given adequate food, shelter, medical care. Many were shocked by this treatment, having been taught to expect barbarity. Many struggled with the cognitive dissonance of being treated well by the enemy. But Erika's story matters because it illuminates a larger truth about that moment in history. The United States, despite its own contradictions and failings, chose to honor international law even when it could have chosen revenge. It chose to see prisoners as human beings with inherent dignity, even when those prisoners came from a regime that had denied humanity to millions. This was not done out of pure altruism. There were strategic reasons, practical considerations, bureaucratic requirements, but the effect was the same. Women who had been told Americans were monsters discovered they were men. Women who had expected cruelty found procedure. Women who had braced for degradation received hot water. And in receiving that hot water, in standing under those showers, in feeling warmth cascade over skin that had known nothing but cold for so long, they learned something that would stay with them forever, that the world contained more possibilities than they had imagined, that enemies could choose mercy, that even in the aftermath of the worst war in human history, humanity could survive. The hot baths were not a footnote. They were a teaching moment, a demonstration of values, a quiet assertion that civilization meant something. They were proof that rules could be followed even when it would be easier to abandon them, that restraint was possible even in victory, that dignity could be extended even to those who had denied it to others. And for the women who experienced them, those hot baths became the symbol of everything that had changed. They marked the moment when the propaganda crumbled, when certainty gave way to doubt, when the enemy became human. They were the beginning of a long process of reckoning with the past, of understanding complicity, of imagining a different future. The steam rising from those showers carried with it more than heat. It carried possibility, the radical notion that the world need not be built on cruelty, that power could be exercised with restraint, that enemies could be treated with dignity. And that lesson, learned in camps scattered across America, carried forward into the reconstruction of Europe, into the Cold War that followed, into the long struggle to build a world where such devastating wars might never happen again. It is a lesson worth remembering that how we treat those in our power reveals who we are. that mercy is not weakness but strength, that the small gestures, the hot baths and bars of soap and moments of kindness can matter as much as the grand strategies and historic battles, that in the end, we are all just human beings trying to survive in a world we barely understand. And sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to add to the sum total of suffering. Erika Schneider stood under hot water in September of 1945 and felt her world shift. She could not have known then that this moment would define the rest of her life, that she would carry it with her across an ocean and through decades, that she would preserve a bar of soap like a sacred relic, that she would tell her story to historians and grandchildren with the same sense of wonder and confusion she felt in that first moment. She only knew that the water was hot, that her body was clean, that the enemy had shown her mercy she did not expect and did not know how to process. And in that not knowing, in that fundamental destabilization of belief, something new became possible. Not forgiveness, not forgetting, but understanding. The recognition that we are all human, all capable of both cruelty and kindness, all responsible for the choices we make about how to exercise the power we hold. The hot water ran cold eventually, it always does. But the memory remained warm and insistent, a reminder that even in the darkest times, even in the aftermath of unimaginable horror, the capacity for human decency can survive. And that capacity, nurtured and protected, can grow into something larger. Into peace, perhaps, or at least into the possibility of peace, into a world where former enemies can live beside each other, where the children of soldiers can become friends, where history can be remembered without being repeated. That was the true victory of those hot baths, that they opened a door to a different future. And women like Erika Schneider walked through that door, bewildered and frightened and forever changed, into a world that was strange and difficult, but ultimately, impossibly full of hope.